Hi, and welcome to Just Breathe. We are a podcast for those who are involved in the world of Unitarian Universalist religious education, whether youth, emerging adults, or anyone who likes to talk about Unitarian Universalism. If you don't know what Unitarian Universalism is, because you clicked on this because it was recommended and you were so excited to check it out, you can learn a little bit more about Unitarian Universalism at uua.org. You can also find Just Breathe on YouTube, or as we would call it in the UU world, YouTube. I am Ember Kelly. I use she and her pronouns. I am a white trans woman wearing a green dress against a overall neutral background with a window to my side. We include visual descriptions because we do also post this onto YouTube. And I am so excited to be joined by my amazing co-host, the one, the only, Joy Berry.
Hi, Amber. Yes, Joy Berry. I am she, her. I'm the Children and Families Faith Development Specialist at the UUA in the LFE, Lifespan Faith Engagement Team. I am a white middle-aged lady with a very colorful background, including a chalice, a headscarf, and some large glasses. I'm coming to you from Western North Carolina today, where I do this sacred work, and I'm so excited to be joined by our guests as well as my amazing co-host. We have with us today Reverend Jim Lewis and Jill Novenski. I look forward to letting them introduce their fantastic work, where they serve, how they serve, and all that good stuff. Today we're going to be talking about interdependence. It's one of our new, or should I say, newly articulated theological values in Unitarian Universalism. And I'll read from our language about that, from the adopted Article 2 language on interdependence. We honor the interdependent web of all existence. With reverence for the great web of life and with humility, we acknowledge our place in it. We covenant to protect Earth and all beings from exploitation. We will create and nurture sustainable relationships of care and respect, mutuality, and justice. We will work to repair harm and damaged relationships. So I'd love to hear from our wonderful guests about themselves a little bit, and also what's coming up for them, what wisdom or wondering they've brought to share today with us about interdependence. Jill, do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Joy. My name is Jill Novenski, and I am the Director of Religious Education for Children and Youth at the Community Church of New York. I use she, her pronouns. I am a late middle-aged white woman, heavy set with dishwater blonde hair up in a bun, slowly going gray, like to think slowly. I have artwork in the background against my wall and a big, huge plant on my back left we call Lucy. So thank you for having me here.
Yeah, tell us about what's your wisdom or wonder?
I will say one thing that I am learning in the practicing of interdependence, which is a practice I'm putting into practice in my life. I would say that I'm learning that the practice of interdependence itself is an act of resistance against a system that is the only system I have ever known. So there are layers. That's what I want to say about that.
Yeah, and I love that idea of practice, right? We're going to get to talk more about that. All right, Jim, you want to come on in?
Sure. Thank you, Joy. My name is Jim Lewis. My pronouns are he and they. And I'm the Minister of Lifespan, Faith Development, and Pastoral Care at Eno River Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm further to the east than Joy. So yeah, it is great to be here. And let's see, my visual description. I am a white non-binary person with a beard that's mostly brown with a little bit of white, especially at the chin. Not much hair on the top of my head. It's pretty empty. And some clear glasses in the front, but they have blue sides. Let's see, wearing a gray t-shirt with a white and blue and beige scarf. And in the background is the very colorful office with orange and purple walls and some fairy lights, but also a little bit of disorganization.
And Jim, can I can I ask you for your piece of like wonder or wisdom, something you said just like really hit me hard in our pre-conversation about this, about interdependence being a given. Would you share that?
I was working with a group of congregants a few weeks ago, and I just had this moment where I'm like, interdependence is always happening, whether or not we think about the term, whether or not we're aware of the interdependence that's happening, heck, whether or not we like it.
Mm.
Like, like all the things that are happening are impacting other pieces. We are always in this perpetual motion of um, people and communities bouncing off of each other and interacting with each other and seeing what happens.
Right. And when we do that in congregational work, that has all these, as you said, I think layers that we want to definitely get into. Um, so yeah, I'm hopeful that that thread about how it's always happening is something that will run through this conversation because I think it's a little bit subversive. And I'm thinking about how Jill, the thing that you said back to Jim, it was just such like a nice organic little bubbling up. Would you mind to share that and just kind of start us off on that?
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely agree, first off, obviously. And I have found myself more often in a lot of the UU culture shifts, looking at what is always happening. Transformation is one thing and interdependence is another. And so it's happening around us, but I do believe that a lot of us are slow to recognize, or we keep it invisible because it's uncomfortable, because it holds us accountable then once we recognize. So that discomfort, dominant culture will do a lot of strange things to get comfortable. So it's been a process and it continues to be kind of a process. But I think remembering and examining our earth and our nature and all that is going on all the time is really helpful.
There's a blog that I'm working on writing with a colleague talking about change, because there's a little bit of change going on in the world these days, just some small changes. But as both of you were talking, it got me thinking about this piece because one of the things that I said as we started brainstorming it was that it's a really unique time that we're in, that we think that change isn't the norm, that these last like 50, 60 years of American empire, that this was like, okay, this is the end of history, this is the way it's supposed to be, and we're going to have these institutions that will be the same forever, and everything will be the same, and I'll be able to have my nuclear family, which will then have another nuclear family, and this whole idea that things were going to always be the same, that has so much in common with this idea that our actions don't impact this interdependent web that's all around us. Like before this, like normalization where everything entered these very static things, people, if they're out farming, they know that the land in the world is changing around them. They have to pay attention to the seasons, that change was much more a part of life in that sort of culture. But then we became very like urban, very like these are going to be the institutions we have for forever. And so that bubbled up, and hearing you all talk about this and thinking about how this is a change from this culture that we've been told where we aren't interdependent, where everything's going to stay the same forever. But a much more beautiful vision of the world is one where things change, even when that change is not fun, and where we are interdependent on one another. So that's the thing that kind of help us face that change. But what also helps us face that change is a little word that Jill mentioned there too, and that is everybody's favorite thing, accountability. Yeah, I mean, I get it, Joy. I too get excited about accountability. But so I really actually would love to talk a little bit more about accountability and, why people get a little uncomfortable about the idea that we might be accountable to one another. And yeah, would anybody like to say a little bit more about what accountability calls us to in this interdependent world of ours?
Since I'm the one that said it first, I don't want to overspeak, Reverend Jim. But I will say that for me, accountability starts with myself. It starts with me checking in and being honest about my place in the world, in the systems and the framework that already exist. So that means I am privileged, whether I asked for that or not, because I am a white woman in America. So starting there is a good uncomfortable place to start, and because of that privilege, what is it that I rock with that privilege? It starts from those bite-sized chunks. And for me, accountability really looks like using mutual aid mindset and liberation theology tenets as my guide forward, because there's a little bit of a stun for the moment that I have to recognize I've been betrayed by a capitalist system that taught me that independence was freedom and strength, that pulling yourself up by the bootstraps is where it's at. So I now don't trust leaning on someone else, and I have to get into that, and I have to dig into that quite a bit. So, and I have to recognize that my neighbors, friends, colleagues, and folks that are coming from traditionally marginalized identities have experiences that I need to listen to, so I understand my start point. For me, that's what accountability means when it comes to interdependence.
For me, if I'm thinking about accountability with interdependence, I actually end up starting that probably with the thought of how are we in relationship at any given time? Like I could speak to that in a congregational level, but often when I speak to congregants, I actually bring it back to what are the relationships that we are in personally and how that translates into the congregation. So, I have a partner, and if I'm supposed to take out the trash and I don't take out the trash and we have an argument about it, I have to decide what I'm doing in that relationship to be accountable. And that doesn't mean I don't get to show up as an individual, but it does mean if I want to sustain this relationship, I have to think about how am I day to day accountable for anything I say or do. And it's not a thing of like sitting there and obsessing, oh my gosh, is every word right? But it is that thing of like when something happens that brings the relationship into a challenging space,
Right.
if I want the relationship to continue, I have to decide to show up. And I have to decide to show up with humility so that I can be part of that system and that part of whatever that relationship is. And so in a congregational setting, it gets a little more complex. You got more people there. And, I think about it too, being part of a family where most of my chosen family at this point are queer and BIPOC and immigrants, and I am by far the whitest person. Like I have a certain responsibility myself. I would say an accountability that hasn't been asked of me by family, but to educate myself on the experiences of those I'm in familial relationship with so that I can be a support without having to go to them for education. I like that because it's supporting my family. It's supporting my family in relationship with them rather than, saying, hey, will you teach me how to support you? It's trying to think about, gosh, how am I a good family member? And I think that translates across congregational life too.
I think that's a really important point, that part about not assuming it is okay to tap other folks to tell you how, but to show up fully and with humility. I like that a lot. I think that's really important. A lot of it is very nuanced, like learning how to develop interdependent relationships when you've been socialized in a system that is anti that. Yeah, it really bears a lot of things out in terms of developing, what does that look like? So I think really fine layers like that are so important. The first thing, humility, that's a huge thing for a lot of people. I'm finding that's a really huge thing in and of itself. And that was just your start point. I thought that was great. Because a lot transforms when we soften ourselves that way. Well, we receive information differently. So I think that's really helpful.
Oh, so many good things. Want to pluck at some of those threads. I'm thinking about American exceptionalism and how Unitarian Universalists are in no way exempt. In fact, being that some of our founders on both sides of our faith, we're core folks for America's founding documents and all that, and thinking there's a way in which the worst thing that can happen to you as a person, as a community, as a faith or denomination, or as a society, is to become convinced that things aren't going to change because we've arrived. And we've arrived because we've done the right things. And therefore, we don't really have to examine with humility, with a sense of concern about marginalized voices or the prophetic edge, because it's so self-evident, isn't it? That wonderful phrase that comes straight from, I guess that's the Declaration of Independence. So self-evident. And when change happens, particularly in times of challenge, for people of faith at least, we really are asked to kind of get radical, by which I mean go to the root, that word ratus, root, to get radical about how we actually are aligning with our theology and our principles. Because it is so easy to say and it is much harder to do, isn't it? I think, Jill, I felt that in your words about how, first I just gotta do the work, right? It's not easy, but practice, right? An apprentice mind to that. What this kind of circles around to for me is, it feels to me that as much as there are societal narratives right now that make it clear that some things must change in order to align with our aspirations as America, the story of America, it's the same thing for our faith. And the hardest thing to notice is the thing that's not already in the room, the thing that's not already on the table, right, with regard to interdependence. And I've been thinking about how much we as Unitarian Universalists need to be accountable and in a state of learning, curiosity, and openness, to change around things like dismantling our own white supremacy culture in our congregations and moving towards a more deeply engaged shared ministry approach that is missional, by which I mean relational and positional, going to where we're needed, not asking everyone to come to us and our norms and our centered expectations. And then also incarnational. How do we truly, embody and live, make real, give in the flesh this theology we agree on? So anyway, I've only got one sermon, and it is about whole church religious education, because I do feel that in many ways, those with some of the most power, affluence, and authority in our faith, just like in our society, have sort of like not minded the gap as well as could have been done, such that we have a strong bench of cultivation of all of this lived value stuff. So when we start talking about what kinds of changes are being asked of us in Unitarian Universalism in congregations by our people, and also by the idea that we should be preemptively and radically open, inclusive, and accessible, because we don't know what we don't know, and we don't know who we're missing yet, who could be with us. I'm kind of wondering what comes up for y'all around moving towards a missional core sense that our work in church is to do faith development and to let that ground our work, especially beyond the church walls. But it's not easy, because once you've been centered, what is that saying? Somebody will have to fix it for me probably. I'm like George Bush about these things. It's like, when you're privileged, equity feels like oppression. That's so real, like to put words to that as is a pretty sharp little blade, because you don't know how much you resist change, accountability, and interdependence until you hear that voice calling for a little more space, a little more centering, a little more belonging. So where are the areas that this kind of thinking, what does it make you think about, and how it can bless us into into making our aspirations a little more real?
I think for me at a community church where I am in New York City, I mean, we have a pretty unique situation. We sold our church building. We conduct our services in the afternoon on Sundays in a rented Episcopalian church space. So there's lots of interdependence happening with us, just by necessity being the mother of invention. And at the same time, and we have, a over the course of the past 5 years, a new minister after 40 years of pretty much one minister. So we have the first woman minister in the 200-year history of the church.
Wow.
And so lots of things are different at community than it was before. But one thing is the same. We have a very large staff, very large staff. And so what do we do with this staff heavy situation when congregations are dwindling, aging? How do we grow? How do we do that without a space? It kind of forces you into a place of having to be, really lean on the connections outside of yourself. One of the attitudes that we've adopted along the way, which I have found to be really helpful, is this ministry of yes. Well, the idea is that when someone has an idea for a program or an event or a sermon even, that the idea is to say yes first and then figure out together how do we bring that to life. And so that's sort of the culture with us, which has extended itself because each time that we go through that process, we remind ourselves that we are mission oriented and that there's a denominational mission that we are serving that's greater than our church walls, whatever those are at the moment. So that has been a guide. And I think that that's been really great. It's sort of like saying yes first does not mean saying yes to everything and that everything will occur. But it is saying that first we present with a green light and we trust that together we're going to figure out what's right from there.
I can imagine how in a different space, time, or with different intentionality, that kind of saying yes, a ministry of yes, would have been resisted, perhaps because it could lead to a greater affinity culture in church. How do you make sure that the ask is open and truly extended to everyone so you're not reproducing the biases? How do you work on that?
That's a really good question. And for me, I want to say, and I again don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to say that I think practice of interdependence requires a constant assessment of needs and resources. And that has to be constant because it's very nuanced. What the needs are, assessing resources when you're someone coming from a place of privilege in a particular context is going to be different than someone who's showing up with needs, assessing resources in the space. So I think it starts with a ministry of yes, with those of us who have the wherewithal, bandwidth, and focus on mission, putting it into practice to show others who may be unfamiliar and setting the tone that way and starting from there. I mean, the culture shifting cannot be expected to happen all at once. We're all training ourselves, those of us particularly who have come from a privileged space in dominant culture. So
But I hear a collaborative effort around a shared ministry approach there. When I think about how beleaguering it might feel if you were just a single minister, or, it might feel really impossible to say yes. I'm fascinated by this idea that a more of a collaborative shared ministry could help us say yes to more and make sure we're extending the inclusivity, and the welcome there. I'm really, really loving about hearing about that.
What was striking me around this idea of change and accountability and how we come together as a congregation over time, I find I feel very blessed to be in the congregation that I'm in because there's so many things that we're already manifesting here. And I'm not the lead minister. I'm one of 3 full-time ministers. We have a quite large congregation. And I'm not the lead minister, but one thing that I saw in her ministry, Reverend Jacqueline Brett, and that she talked about that I've also taken on is this concept that this community has always been changing. And that the people who have already been here have helped do some of that work. They have helped bring us to where we are. And now, as good stewards of this space, we need to keep considering, where are we growing toward? Where are we growing towards including? I think it helps that we have these 2 founding members who are still surviving and thriving in here. And when they look around our 11 a.m. Sunday service, which has become a lot more racially diverse and more queer folks there, more young folks there, they are excited about it. and they say, this is the congregation we always hoped this would be. It is becoming the congregation we hoped it would be. And that takes effort. I've only been here 2.5 years. We have a theory of change committee that has existed since, I want to say 2016, 2017. I talk about it all the time because it's a team who has had like this long-spanning focus on how do we create culture change that encourages racial diversity in the congregation. And what I love about it is when they started presenting on this to teams, it's not talk about it and then we have a more racially diverse congregation and we're done. It's this process of we have to explain, like we need to have leaders first who are competent about REI and DEI initiatives. And then those leaders need to be thinking about the infrastructures in the congregation and make sure that they're informed and welcoming. And then those folks need to be informing the congregation. And so there's all these steps up to making it happen. Culture change takes a long time. And I always hold the pastoral side of it too, that anytime something changes, there's always the opportunity that somebody will be sad to see something go. And that's real. And just because we are sad does not mean that the change isn't good. It could still be warm and wonderful as a change. And yeah, there will be folks who will miss pieces or ways that things have been done. That's also real. And that doesn't mean we don't do it.
I'm thinking about how change might compel us to think about the future more than the past. I know raising my kids in the church over the last 16 years as a DRE, congregationally, for most of that, I heard a lot of talk about the legacy that our ancestors gave to us. But in the last several years, I've been thinking about how little I hear UUs talk about becoming a good ancestor, because that forces us to think beyond the threshold of where we are and all we've been given. And it also really activates us potentially in a good way, but I know reactivity is a very common response to change. But it activates us to think, okay, if I've been given all these gifts, or if this denomination, this faith has had so much invested in it, what is my role as a steward to make sure it continues and to work for cultural perpetuity? And being someone who thinks about children and families a lot, I have to acknowledge that in the given moment, sometimes it's very hard for our younger UUs, as much as they love our aspirational values, the narrative of what we are here for and who our hearts break for and how we're going to be. It's very difficult, especially for younger people, to not see the discrepancies at times between what we say and how we do things, just how we do church. So I've been thinking about that idea of becoming a good ancestor. And it seemed to me, Jim, that you were kind of, leaning that way a little bit as well, insofar as how being together in different ways calls us to both witness and imagine further how we can center more of the behaviors that could get us to the future, and that church that I think is praying for us to survive there. Any thoughts about that with regard to how interdependence moves us towards cultural perpetuity and becoming a good ancestor? Particularly, we'll segue kind of towards the whole church RE lens, which has so much diversity to how it can be done, but particularly thinking about that. How does thinking about doing church together differently move us towards some of that focus on the legacy we leave, not just that we have received?
It's something that I always hold in that trajectory where, like, someday we will be seen as the ancestors. And so, like, what are we building forward? Like 100% what you were saying, Joy. And how are we building communities? I think this is a controversial thing sometimes to say, but I believe that our future is in the most progressive edges of what we have to offer. And also, historically, often those most progressive edges have come from our youth, actually, and where our youth have been pushing us forward. And so it's, I kind of believe we are a little bit of a faith of heretics, that like any generation, the heretics from a generation or two before suddenly are the central folks. And so I'm thinking about like right now, who are the people who are nudging us forward into something? Because my belief is I just do not see people my generation and younger excited to show up to something that's not pushing that progressive edge. And if they are, it's not something that you is intense about. Like if you want a moderate space, there's plenty of those. If you want a moderate spirit, religious and spiritual space, there are plenty of those in this world. And they are more theologically, I want to say theologically specific. And so I think that the gifts that we really have as Unitarian Universalism is that pushing forward into what can be. And that never stops. Like that never becomes a static thing. It's also that idea of like, if we don't have children or youth, where is that future? Is it just from our UU converts? I'm not saying that like UU converts are great. I'm a UU convert. But also, it's thinking about like what is that trajectory we're building into the world? What is the goodness that are we putting into the world? And it's how we interact with those families, how those families are carrying forward those values into life, into those lived values. So I think there is such an important piece of that, like, what do we want to become? What do we want to have be the work that we as ancestors have done in this space? Just feels so essential.
It's interesting for me. I hear everything said, and I totally do agree with so much of it. At the same time, I think my personal stance there has been to not invest in the idea of whatever the legacy will be, although that is not to say that I qualify that as not the right thing. It's not that at all. But I do find myself moving more in a space of presence and practice. Uh, and just whatever comes of that must be positive if I'm making my best effort. And I think in congregational life, what that has looked like, I mean, what the conversation we're having, it always brings me back to that saying, that quote, that we didn't inherit the earth from our ancestors, but we were borrowing it from our children. I remember a religious education Sunday years ago, and I was just an RE teacher at the time, tasked with showing up to the microphone and giving a little synopsis of the year and the whole thing. And and of course, witching hour the night before, I'm frantically writing. I don't even know what I'm going to say. So it's a long time ago, and I wasn't as deep in the work as I am now, but I was deep enough that I decided, you know what, why don't you just start with the truth? So that's exactly what I did, to say every week I'm tasked with showing up to teach these young people values and how to put those into practice and all of that. The truth of the matter is, I show up every week and am reminded of the values that they are totally putting in practice every single day. And so that's, I absolutely think the youth are where the growth lives. And I love, Joy, what you said about thinking about the ancestors we want to be, and also thinking about young people as future ancestors. Looking forward, I mean, what about Sankofa, right? You have to look back, right? And that's really important wisdom that we learn from the sources we claim to get inspiration from. So I think it's time now that we really look deeply at those sources and see how is interdependence working in that way. I mean, listen, it's uncomfortable because it takes longer, right?
Mm.
It's more time consuming, it's less immediate, it's less convenient, right? And it involves compromise. God forbid it involves
Yep.
compromise. So and it requires, if we're really putting it into practice, that we are not so invested in a final vision
Mm.
that we have in our head, which can't possibly be the vision that once everyone's got their input in, it'll actually be. So, those are tough things. So all the things we were socialized against in our lives, have a goal, eyes on the prize, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. All of those things have socialized us against everything it takes to practice that level of compromise and openness and not knowing. And in the same time, young people are in that space all day, every day. They're living in transformation all day, every day. So I definitely look to my youth group for wisdom on the regular.
I love that so much. And I think that's a really important thing to name is that we're weaving together this story of who we, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? That's so important. And one of the things that I think is calling to us from the edges right now that promotes our interdependent capacity is my own recognition that our adults are bringing some fairly core wounds that we have not really talked about, kind of a family systems approach here. Sometimes I recognize that the activation and reactivity that I see when we move towards a more interdependent experience seems to be based in some places where we probably really do need to do some more work, like adults who didn't get all their needs met and weren't allowed to experience joy and healing and repair in the systems, their systems of origin, shall we say, and how core it is for us as a church to not only support those who are going out to be to do the embodied and incarnated work in the world of being UUs, and that really often to me is especially our families and young people, because they are the most active in this time of change. But our adults are bringing us needs too. They just don't always have the capacity to say them. So often I see our adults unmet, unverbalized needs in some reactivity. And I kind of wanted to follow up on that, especially with you, Jim, because that idea about how we would do this sacred work of healing and belonging and reclaiming joy, like the stuff we do with religious education that might appear to center children and young people and families can be a really powerful Trojan horse to not only introduce multicultural values as an antidote to white supremacy culture, but then do that deeper relational stuff that our adults don't know how to ask for and may not even know they need. Do you want to pick up there and tell us a little bit more about your understanding of that?
That there's a piece of me that says that there's always an element of that being pastoral, where there is like a nuancing of like where is that wound, where is there potentially some trauma, where have those expectations come from that something must be this way, while also holding somebody and going through that. But we have this thing that's been happening this year, and again, I am blessed because I have adults and elders who are like, we want more multi-generational contact. How are you going to make it happen? And and I'm like, oh no, I'm not the genius at all things. And so like we had this trip last year that was great, um, in intention, and we just noticed that the adults and the youth never interacted on the whole trip. And they got back and there were complaints about it, and I thought about it. I'm like, oh no, we have to teach them. We have to teach them and structure their interaction. And what are we going to structure it like? So this year we've returned to a coming of age curriculum for our ninth and 10th graders. And 2 years ago, when we were reworking what elders look like, because we're not having them pair one-on-one because congregational health, it's like, what does this look like? Fell flat on its face, was not effective. And so I sat down with with my youth specialist who was new this year. It's like, what do we do with this? And what we noticed the first time, like we had this game that we started out and we had them play it in mixed elder and youth teams very intentionally. And then we had them going around sharing wisdom with each other. But what we noticed was how engaged all of them were, how excited all of them were. And over time, I've watched it, and it's really about this nuance of the youth and the elders building a relationship that is about them being nuanced human beings, where they get to see these elders be silly. They get to see them be joyful. They get to see them be cantankerous sometimes. And like the youth are like, oh, that's so and so. Oh, we love him. And so they have this embodied relationship that's very nuanced with this group of elders because it hasn't just been come in and give us your wisdom. It's been come in and play and also give us we want to hear these pieces of you too. And so right now we're like, oh gosh, how do we spread this more? Like, how do we spread this more? So we're thinking about it because it ends up more complicated than who's volunteering or making sure the spots are filled. It's how to develop those relationships. And, it's realizing that sometimes we have to like set the frame of it, but we really have to build joy into that puzzle too.
Thank you. It's a wonderful example to hear about and how it makes us think about relationships and locations and events differently than just who's in what class and who's the teacher. Yeah. How do we make community happen?
I think creating that kind of intergenerational space and building framework, like you said, Reverend Jim, is so critical right now. We had a program at Community that I am going to be rerunning again with a guest artist that came in. It's a waste weaving workshop that this person was doing as a part of their I think there was a thesis project that they were on, and they told me about this idea that they were doing with elders in communities around memory, this waste weaving workshop. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if that were kind of like a multi-gen thing? And it was an amazing experience because here we are, like zero budget, the cardboard looms, it's just all accessible stuff. People brought their detritus, your waist, your little, zip ties and little twist ties and loose threads and that. And there we sat. One of the sessions we had from age probably 10 or 12 to 85 in the room. And we're weaving together our bits and we're all of us creating something. None of us know what it's going to be. It's probably not something we'll hang on the wall, but maybe we will. You know what I mean? But in the interim was this sharing, like you said, Reverend Jim, this nuanced sharing and relationship building, the storytelling of the waste and how do we let things go? And what do we do with things if we can't let go, can we make art with it? And it was a sharing of the stories of learning to sew when they were young, who are now octogenarians and younger kids not knowing much about that, but telling them about an app that taught me to do such and such. And all of a sudden, you're having this information share. And I feel like the more we can help to create framework that isn't so focused on an end result, because that was one of the beautiful things about the waste weaving workshop. Like number one off the top, don't worry about what it is you create. So there's no mistakes. And everyone kind of gets to shed their perfectionism. And the more we can do that and foster space like that, I think the answers are kind of right before us. And I think they're complicated by how we've been socialized. Then once we untangle that hairball each time, we leave space, and the humans that are in that space will create relationship because that's really what we do.
There's something that Jim said earlier about um the UU converts, and I was looking over our guest. I'm like, are all four of us, in fact, later in life, UUers, and I believe we might all be then. And in a previous evangelical life of mine, the denomination I joined, the saying was that you were either born into it or married into it. I joined it because I was dating someone who was into it, so I qualified for the second. And um, there was no culture of like, how do you bring in people? So I think it's fascinating that we have this like great culture of like, hey, everybody's welcome, but that we're learning how to live into this commitment to hearing our young people, to hearing the next generation and what they're calling for. Originally I had planned that my final question was going to be like, what are stories of collaboration? But then I just listened to like a whole bunch of stories about collaboration and this intergenerational connection, and it was just so beautiful. And the word that comes to mind with interdependence for me is like sustainable. Like, how do we build these relationships that are healthy? A lot of my sermons when I was at the Staten Island congregation, I spent a bunch talking about covenant, right relationship, because I wanted to hammer home that, like, it's not the size of the congregation, it's not that you have the fanciest programming. What are the relationships that you're building? So I suppose as a final wrap up is, what does sustainable relationship in our communities or moving even outside of our communities, what does that look like for you in the UU world, in your personal life? Either or.
I will say that when I came into the work as a DRE in 2019, right before the lockdown, I was fascinated by this idea that so many young people bridge and don't come back until presumably maybe they have families, maybe they'll come. And I saw that gap and thought, well, me coming to church, late in life. What is church and how would I view that if I were a young person? So thinking about building a sustainable church culture, a couple of things, looking outside of our church walls, not only creating things to appeal to who we have inside our walls, but people like me who knew nothing about Unitarian Universalism and is now a DRE with lots of ideas. And I think that one of the other ways of maintaining sustainability is to think about church being a cool place, being a skill building place, being a place where young people can actually get a reference for a college recommendation, right? Like something like that. Why couldn't that be church with all of the values that we hold as you use? It's so right on the ground. This is not about later. It's not about some judgment in the afterlife. This is about how do you choose to be in relationship with one another and the earth right now. So if church can embody all of the elements that one would look for in building their life, I think that that is a great way to sustain church life and culture.
There's this thing for me about this relational piece in congregations where I'm a firm believer that you have to decide you're on the same team. Because I feel like this is the seventh congregation I've been associated with, either as a layperson, staff member, whatever, and seen many others. And I am so blessed, but I realize it's because here we consistently decide we're on the same team. And so even if we don't agree, even if we have challenges, we figured it out. My RE ministry team has decided that they are on the same team with me. And so even when they have critiques of me, they bring it to me and we discuss it. Our volunteers in RE we've decided we are on the same team. Our congregation tries to be on the same team with the staff. Our cluster of religious educators, we are on the same team. We talk about how we are not in competition, even though we're all a half-hour drive from each other. It's like, this is not a competition between us. This is what we are building as a tradition. And the struggles that I see when people are not on the same team, it comes back to humility for me. You have to decide that you're building a thing rather than it's my thing. You're building a thing. And I think some of that is even more humility when we are interacting, especially with folks in marginalized communities who are not our own, because there's often an experience of being told, yes, come over here, and then being told, oh, wait, you're not actually on our team. We just want your representation to show up. You have to live into it even more fully and show up even more humble sometimes if you want to make it a real relationship rather than just looking like something that could be a relationship. It takes more. And that's good. And I've seen it happen, and it can be a challenge sometimes too. It's culture change.
Amen.
We have such a disconnected culture. If we can't do it in faith community to help people learn how to connect those raggedy ass ends in covenant on the loom, right? Then what are we even doing here? It's our unique competency as one of the last multi-generational spaces to be able to really connect the hard parts and the good parts and remind us that we really are all in this together. I love your simple, abundant language, Jim. I just want to thank you for what you've shared. I mean, both of you, but what else do we need to say though to bring this home?
I am so thankful for the wisdom, Jill and Jim, that you shared today. Like, this is just some absolutely beautiful stuff and so meaningful. And it's been really wonderful to get to hear too, and remind me in my work what motivates me in the interdependence and letting our youth guide us, and so many things. And I'm so excited to talk about our Just Breathe coming up for May as well, where we're going to be exploring that little thing that it centers around in our shared values. Love at the center, grounded in love, whichever phrase you might like. We're going to be talking with fabulous panelists, Avery Miller Fabregast and UUA President, the Reverend, the Doctor, the Sophia Betancourt. We're really excited to conclude this season of Just Breathe with a bang. It feels like we just started yesterday. Be sure to like and subscribe to this page on YouTube. Follow us on Instagram at Just Breathe Pod, JUUST. Breathe with an E. Don't forget that E, pod. And spread the word about your favorite UU podcast.
Thanks, y'all.
Mystery. mystery. Life is a riddle and a mystery.